Hello, everybody. Welcome to my webinar. I'm Sushil Chamba, and I'm going to talk to you today about project cost. How right is that feeling in my bones? So a little bit about me to begin with. I work for Risk Decisions, and I've been working for them since I was a child for many, many years, over 20 years. So I have a lot of experience working with our various clients in helping them to manage risk, to set risk budgets, and to set project budgets. So without further ado, I'm going to begin. I intend to be less than an hour, but I don't intend to talk for all of that time. So I will talk to you for some time, and then there'll be time for questions at the end, which you're welcome to put into the chat, and I will take those questions at the end. So let us begin. So when I was thinking about a title for this presentation, I started to think about the expertise that you often find in the room when you're trying to put a project together, when you're either in a bid situation or you're trying to price up a contingency budget for a project. And quite a lot of the time, the people that are doing the work, they sort of know their work, they know the industry, and so have a feeling in their bones, really, about what's going to happen. So I'm going to talk about quantifying that and how you turn that feeling into something that you can present to your stakeholders using a case study of a customer we worked with, which has been anonymized. So the journey will be as follows. I'll talk about the question, what's the feeling in my bones? I'll demonstrate how we quantified that feeling with a particular client. And then I'll talk about how we used Monte Carlo analysis, that's statistical analysis, to take the information that the team have gathered to help define a budget and to decide essentially whether to bid or not bid a particular project. So we'll look at variability in projects, so variability factors and risk events. But more importantly, how you can use that information for Monte Carlo analysis to promote teamwork and success-orientated conversations. And at the end, as I mentioned, I'll take any questions. So let us begin. So the particular example I'm going to share with you is of a road working project. So this was a project delivering to the Highways Agency, and it was actually an unusual type of contracting arrangement, depending on what kind of industry you come from. So our client was in a framework agreement with their customer. So the customer comes forward with a proposal of some work that needs to be done, but they already had an idea in their mind of how much they were going to spend on that project, and they invited all of the people in this framework contract to put in a bid to say, yep, we'll do it for that amount of money. So the client I was working with was interested in the question, so we've got £100 million to do this project. Can we do it for less than that and make a margin? That was the $1 million question. And so the conversation started in the room with the team with the question, what's the feeling in your bones? Do you think it can be done? Now, there's a reasonably negative sort of attitude to this figure, actually, based on past experiences and based on some of the uncertainties that they knew existed in the project they were bidding for. So it was to redevelop a junction and introduce a roundabout into that junction. And they were aware of the location and some of the challenges that location could pose. So already there are people thinking, don't know enough about what's involved. We haven't opened Pandora's box. I'm feeling a bit nervous about this, because when the reality hits, the project could either go upwards of 100 million pounds into the red, but people didn't feel confident that it would go down. So interestingly, in this framework agreement, the budget was already broken down as well. So at a summary level, the customer already estimated that out of that £100 million, 85 million would be for the face value delivery of the work, and they would allow 15 million for the risk budget. That's how they had come up with 100 million. They had broken that down in a little bit more detail as well, but I won't go into that now. Now, in bidding for this project, we had a choice really of how we would spend that 100 million and which budget would go into. So it wasn't a hard and fast rule that 85 million had to go into the project budget and 15 million into a contingency budget. That was something that we could maneuver around in. So the feeling was, okay, don't like the look of this project, don't fancy bidding it. Now, that's not really acceptable to senior management to just come along and say that. So we had to get into the world of quantifying those feelings, evidencing them, and having a real conversation with all our stakeholders about whether to bid or to no bid at £100 million. So we started to think about the budget in its different segments. So there's a delivery budget, which is pricing up the work you're going to do. That's things you know you're going to do. And usually what we see people do when they're pricing up a project is they'll just list a set of 9 items, they'll put an amount of money against them, and they'll add them at the bottom. However, we wanted to move the conversation on to talk about variability in the things you're going to do. Now, people call these different things. It doesn't really matter. And Monte Carlo analysis doesn't really care what you call things. But the principle was that when we actually do the work, these single numbers that we've listed and added up isn't really what's going to happen, because real life is uncertain and things can always go up or down. And I know this from having done the bathroom recently, that I had a feeling in my bones of how much it was going to cost, let's say £10,000, but always knew all along that each aspect of the work being done was going to be a bit more or a bit less than I thought it was going to be. So that's sort of the feeling in your bones aspect of it, really. So sat around the table, people were looking at £100 million and thinking, on balance, looking at the variability and the things involved, I don't think we should bid. And then you start adding into there events that may or may not happen. So things that might go wrong. So of course there are opportunities as well. But in the room, there's a lot of thinking about what could go wrong, what could push that budget up. So there's a risk budget as well to think about, things that you might spend money on, but you might not have to. Of course, you can also find that the scope is unclear, or there are activities and events that you don't agree to as part of the bid. And so that would go into some other budget and not into the project budget. So let's start delving into how we use Monte Carlo to look at the variability in just a delivery budget to start with. Putting risk aside, let's look at doing the work. So as I mentioned earlier, we're quite used to, before people use Monte Carlo, seeing our customers working in this sort of way. So I've sort of abridged this here. You group your activities into a cost breakdown structure. You list your work items and you price them up. Now that might involve materials, that might involve labor, a number of different things. Now they split largely the budget into direct and indirect works. Direct works were the actual building of the road, the roundabout, etc. And indirect works are things like setting up an on-site project office and facilities for the people that were working there. So when they did this exercise, they came up with a budget of £89 million. Okay, so already the conversation around the table was, okay, I told you it was going to be a little bit more than the budget we're being given. So already we were in the situation that the 85 million that the customer thought that we would need to deliver the project was actually looking more like 89 million, which also means that the 15 million we thought we'd have for risk was actually less than we thought it was going to be 11 million. So far, not looking good, is it? Not looking good for a yes to a bid or no bid question. But even within the 89 million, people were nervous because that could go up or down. We just listed a single set of numbers. Some of you may have heard listing a single set of numbers referred to as deterministic estimates. You're determining one answer at the end of it. Real life doesn't produce one answer. 89 million is just one possible future of the project. And actually, there could be any number of futures of the project, either above 89 million or less than 89 million. And that's what we want to understand. It's what we want to have a conversation about. It's not an exact science, but we want a little bit more confidence in the conversation we're having about a bid or no bid. And we want a little bit more confidence when we speak to our stakeholders to say, this is the reason I think we shouldn't bid, or this is the reason why I think we can do it, and we're going to make a margin. So to simplify things with this particular client, they didn't have much time to put this bid together. We looked at the types of things that introduce variability into the project. So this is one way of looking at project uncertainty. It's not the only way. And Monte Carlo analysis, and we use Predict, our software for this, isn't limited to one way of looking at risk and uncertainty, but this is the way we chose to do it for this particular bid. So they looked at the types of things that would influence each work item. So there are some examples here. I'll pick out one. For example, stone rate. The cost of the stone to do this project was mostly expected to vary upwards, very unlikely to be any cheaper than the price we saw today. And the reason there's variability in that is that when the project starts, or by the time you came to the point in the project where you would be making the procurement, you can't be guaranteed that the price you'd be looking at is same as the price you've got today. And you've got other types of uncertainties that aren't applicable to the project we were working on here, but you might have exchange rate, which is a big topic at the moment. As you know, we're almost 1-to-1 against the dollar at the moment. The day you say yes to the bid, you may have a different exchange rate to the time at which it matters. So, in fact, we do have that here, exchange rate. They were procuring from abroad. They've got things like steel rate, the price of labour. Inflation is a very interesting one. Inflation here was estimated before the pandemic. So this project's already in motion. We bid this quite a significant time before the pandemic and before the cost of living crisis and the energy crisis. So you can see there's an estimate of 3 to 6% inflation. But of course, today we live in a world where that's very different. So what they did was they created a table of all the variabilities, and we essentially marked true or not true. Does this variability affect each work item? So we went through all the 89 million pounds worth of work items and tagged them to say which variabilities applied. And so that gave us a bit of granularity without having to do lots and lots of work against making sure that we didn't apply every single variability against every piece of work that was being done. There would have been work items that weren't affected by exchange rate, as I mentioned earlier. So what did that allow us to do? That allowed us to plug that information into Predict to do a Monte Carlo variability analysis. So it's a bit like a weather forecast in a way. It takes inputs of all the things you think might happen. So of course, it depends on the information you put in. And it looks at all the possible futures and tries to work out from those possible futures which are going to be more likely and which are at the extremes. So here we have a range of possible outcomes along the bottom of this graph. Now this is called a distribution graph. It gives you a distribution of all the possible futures, and the height of the red bars tells you how likely that future is relative to the others. Now we've got a couple of polls we're going to do during this webinar. So in a moment, you'll see some answers pop up in relation to a question I'm going to pose to you, just to get your grey cells going. So this chart tells us, for example, that it is actually within those variabilities, plus or minus on each type of factor that's going to influence the project. It is remotely possible to spend £60 million. But we can tell by the height of the red bar, it's so tiny that to hedge our bets on that, to say let's go in at 60 million, is not worth it. Most likely, it seems we're going to spend around the 85 million mark, plus or minus. Sounds all right. But actually, worst case, we'd be spending up to £110 million. So I have a question for you here. Should we budget just for this work in front of us, 85 million? Is 85 million safe for us to go in at? So in a moment, you should see a poll appear for you to be able to vote. So the possible answers are, yeah, let's go for it. Let's budget for 85 million because we're 50% likely to make that. Or is the answer, yeah, let's go for 85 million because we're 50% likely to be on or under that budget? Is the answer no, because we're 50% likely to be over 85 million? Or yes or no for a different reason? So majority have said no to bidding at 85 million, saying that there's a 50% chance that we'll come in over 85 million. Let's see what Monte Carlo tells us. So I worked with the team to interpret what this chart's really telling us. Now that black line down the middle splits the graph in half. So half of the red bar, area of the red bars, is to left and the other half is to right. So that 85 million mark is a 50-50. It says a 50-50 chance, it's a toss of a coin really, that we would spend either side of that amount of money. So if we're happy to go in bidding 50-50 chance of making a loss and overspending what we've said, then of course we could bid at that level. But actually, what the senior management wanted was confidence that we could go in and bid at a level that we're very likely to make a margin. Now, there are reasons for going in at 50%. So they chose 90%. They wanted 90% confidence that the budget they set aside and they went in with was not going to be overrun. There are reasons to bid at 50% or to go for a lower confidence. We worked with the Athletes Village for the 2012 Olympics. And our customer there, we worked with them to put in a bid. And the most important thing to them was schedule, because you don't want to be the contractor that delivers late into the Olympics. And it was seen as a bit of a potential loss leader. As it happens, they came in on time and on budget, but they're willing to take a bit of a risk and say, if we overspend, it's worth it because actually it's going to enhance our reputation to have delivered successful Athletes Village project, and that should build our reputation to win more business. So it sounds like the majority of you have agreed that we shouldn't bid at 85 million because we'd only be 50-50 confident that we wouldn't go over that. So moving onwards. So actually the picture's got worse. So this will often happen in Monte Carlo analysis, is that people will either say, I don't believe that, I think we can do it cheaper, don't like the answer. Now, all Monte Carlo analysis is doing is taking what you understand of the world as an input and trying to show you the possible futures. So this was just the beginning of a conversation. So yes, of course, we've got up to 92 million for the delivery budget if we want to be confident of not making a loss, but that only now leaves 8 million for risk. We haven't even put together the risk register yet and started to see how much we might spend on things going wrong. So at the moment, we're still looking increasingly like it should be a no bid scenario. But we don't just sit and admire the bad news. And this is where Monte Carlo comes into its own. It promotes a conversation. So this is something called a tornado chart. That tells us the drivers of what's going to send you up or down. So that red arrow up or that green arrow down, what's going to drive that? And so a tornado chart, which is called this because if you do a mirror image of it, it looks a bit like a tornado. Tells you the in descending order, the biggest drivers that are influencing your final figure. And stone rate came up at the top. There are a few other things, but I'm going to pick stone rate as an example. Now, when we presented this tornado chart, a very unusual thing happened. People started to get energized, and people started to have conversations about variability and risk. Somebody piped up and said, "Well, I could have told you that," which is very interesting because there wasn't the conversation being had before we did the Monte Carlo analysis about what factors we could influence. Now, as it happened, we had the right people in the room, and there was somebody in that room who had the solution, as well as somebody who could have told us already that stone rate was going to be an issue for this project, because they'd seen this in previous projects. There's somebody in the room who said, "But we're planning to do 10, 15 of these projects over the next few years. We've got good warehousing capability. Why don't we buy the stone now? Because even if we don't bid this project, or even if we don't win this project, we're going to use it anyway." So that wasn't the only conversation being had, but a number of conversations started to be had about how we can bring some of these top drivers under control, bring them down a bit. And of course, as we updated our inputs into the Monte Carlo analysis, Predict would update itself automatically to say, well, actually, you said now you're going to do this. These are the new top drivers. So we went through an iterative process, really, of trying to bring stuff under control that we thought was more controllable, and bringing down the amount of money we thought we were going to spend. So here we are, back to the variability factors that we saw earlier. So taking just one example here, we trimmed down the variability factors for stone rate. In fact, with the possibility of being more likely to vary downwards. So in fact, that assumption on the right there, it's now wrong, because what we found was that you could go out, bulk buy the stone, buy it now on the basis that you're hedging that you'll win some projects over the coming years, and they've got the storage capability that isn't going to cost more than the saving. So again, these numbers have been adapted to anonymize the case study, but it meant that we could bring down those slightly inflated costs of stone. And we did that for various other factors. In fact, I jumped back to this chart a bit. There are some work items as well that could be brought under control. It didn't have to be the variability factors themselves that were influencing across the project. It could be particular work items, new ways to do things, reusing materials you've already got, repurposing something for a project, like the IT, for example. I'll come back to that later, and repurposing that for this project. Okay, so that changed the picture actually. Looking at those variabilities, not admiring how bad things might look, but actually quantifying that feeling in our bones, which was actually valid. The feelings that people were having in their bones were all valid. These were cost estimating experts, people who knew their stuff, but quantifying that into Monte Carlo analysis and having a conversation not only allowed them to have conversation with senior management and prepare for conversations with their customer, also allowed them to make decisions that would improve performance. So we got ourselves to a position where we would be 90% confident in an £82 million budget. Here we go. The journey continues. We're bumping around. We found ourselves able to be confident of doing the delivery of the work in £82 million, but leaving ourselves 18 million left over for the risk budget, which is actually more than our client end customer thought we would need. Okay, so things are starting to look a bit up now. People around the table are upbeat. Conversation senior management are looking a bit more upbeat. People aren't so certain that it's just a gut feeling, no bid. So let me move on to risk budget. So we sort of signed off that it's 82 million to deliver the work itself, taking into control some of the variabilities in the project. So let's look at the right-hand side then. So we've bimbled around with our risk budget. not in any quantifiable way other than what's left over from 100 million pounds. So just before we go into risk budget, I'm just going to sort of recap for people, especially those who haven't come from directly a risk background, but just from a cost estimating background. It's an event, so it may or may not happen. That if it happens, it's going to have an impact on your objectives. So in this particular situation, we were interested in things that may or may not happen that would impact the cost of the project. So that 82 million for doing the work, that actually add to that with some opportunities, save some money. So it's got a probability percentage, which means it might not happen. We don't know exactly how much it might cost if it does happen. So, for example, 25% chance that you'll find uncertain ground conditions. You put your shovels in, and if you find those, 100 to 200,000 pounds in rework. Those are types of statements we're making in a bit more detail, describing causes, consequences, assumptions, all those kinds of things. But they're the sorts of information that we're putting in to our risk register. A question we ask ourselves: should we budget for every risk happening? We'll come on in a minute to a poll that will help us to explore that question. So here is a risk register in Predict. It's not all the risks, it's just the first few. And you'll see that, as we know, projects are uncertain, that any of these risks could happen or they could not, which means that any budget we set for these risks is one of many possible futures. So here we have a probability for each risk and a ranged estimate for what the cost of that risk might be should it occur. Now, I already mentioned that this is the first few of many risks. And actually, if we add up the maximum impact of all the risks, that comes up to 39 million pounds, meaning that if all our risks happened, if everything went wrong, let's separate opportunities for now, just very deliberately for the purpose of this presentation. If everything went wrong, the worst case is 39 million pounds spent. Now, I've put a value here called expected value. People call it different things, but what people would have done before Monte Carlo would have just taken the likely impact of each risk, multiply it by probability, and just add those numbers up and come up with a single possible future of 11 million and just budget at that. Now, working with our client, we made sure we took a more nuanced view on how much we might spend on risk, which we'll look at in a minute. But first, a poll, which you'll see appear in a moment on the right. I'm going to give you a set of amount of money you might end up spending on risks happening throughout the project. One of them is a wrong answer based on the information you see before you. So which of these amounts of money is it not possible to spend? So remembering that risks, all of these risks are a set of things that may possibly happen during the project. Some will happen, some won't. You don't know until you've done the project which things have gone wrong. So do cast your votes now. So again, you're voting on what is a wrong answer, which value is not a possible amount of money to spend on all of your risks by the end of the project. I'll give you a moment to think about that. And then we'll look at that against another graph similar to the one we looked at earlier for budgeting for the project. We'll look at that for the risk budget as well. Right, so we've got most of our votes in. So actually, the majority of people have said that £0 is not a possible amount. It's not possible to spend £0 on risk. It actually is, no matter how infinitesimally small the likelihood is possible that you'll be super lucky and you'll get all the way through the project without any risks happening. But granted, it's so unlikely that I imagine people would tick the box that it's not a possible amount of money to spend on risk. I imagine some of the people that have voted for £0 have been bitten in the past and have had that experience of expecting the worst. But it is theoretically possible to spend nothing on risk, but it's highly unlikely that you'll get through the project without doing that. It's also theoretically possible to spend £85,000 on risk. In fact, there's a risk in there that has a minimum value of £85,000. So if it happened, the least it would cost you is 85,000. Same as 4.5 million, because we know the worst case is 39 million. Then obviously there's a chance you would spend 4.5 million. We've got a third of people said 100 million is not a possible answer, and that is correct. We can't spend based on the information we've got in front of us, because of course all our quantification is based on what we know, what we tell the Monte Carlo analysis. It's not possible to spend 100 million, because we've seen here that if we added up the worst case of all the risks, even those only add up to 39 million. So I just wanted those grey cells going a little bit in order to move on to the next slide, really. So what this chart is showing us is all the possible futures for that set of risks. So we could spend very little on risk, £0, but it's highly unlikely. So as I said earlier, the vertical red line tells you out of all the possible futures, how likely or how often that future would happen. Not very likely at all. It seems likely that we'd spend plus or minus £10 million on those risks. But actually, if you wanted a 90% confidence that we would cover our risks, so 90% of our futures would be covered by having 15 million in the risk pot in our contingency budget, set aside for things that might go wrong. Now, this graph is a bit of an unusual shape. It carries on all the way up to 40 million. And that's because you might remember I said earlier that if all the risks happened, I know that's unlikely, but if they all happened at their worst impact, we could find ourselves spending 39 million. So that's a terrifying exposure to overrun. So even though we're 90% confidence of spending 50 million, people were looking at this graph and thinking, oh, I really don't like the look of that. And they're getting their headspace back into a no bid scenario. But we'll see in a moment, it's not about admiring the problems. We can use some of the insights that Monte Carlo gives us to tell us, in this case, which the project killer risks were, the ones where that's such low probability, which is why they appear over here to the right. But if they happen, they'd be catastrophic. So here we have another tornado chart. But actually, you'll see there's 3 items at the top of the tornado chart that completely dwarf any other sources of risk as being drivers to the massive overrun. Let's pick the top one, dormice. Now, dormice, I didn't know, were a protected species. So though you might drive past roadworks each day, miserably stuck in them, they're actually a lot more interesting, I realised, than you might think. So if they found dormice in doing this project, that basically means a protected species, and there's a whole load of cost involved then in dealing with that, whether it's relocating them to a new habitat or doing something else that requires some form of rework. Now, if I was bidding for that project, I wouldn't want to be liable for that risk, because I'm just there to do the project work. So actually, you can't negotiate with dormice, but you can negotiate with your customer. So the question here is, can we negotiate that risk out and say, if we find these really extreme things, we're not really covering that in our budget, that'll be transferred to the customer. Nesting birds is another one. Archaeological finds is an interesting one that usually involves stopping work. So on Crossrail, you might be aware that before they started those sets of work, they did some pre-digging actually to look for plague victims, because if you find a plague victim, not a recent one, this is from centuries ago, if you find one of those, you stop work really, because it's an archaeological find. So it's good to know that up front whether those are there. Some of you will also be aware that Richard III was found buried under a car park in Leicester. So it is amazing what you find when you start your project, but it is possible to negotiate them out of the contract to say, this isn't covered in the work we're doing. And that allows you to bring a bit more focus to things that you can control in terms of risk. So you're seeing that this day you've got additional lighting. So there was a question mark between two sets of work being done, between one junction and another. The other junction was already in progress by another contractor about who covers the lighting, because there's a legal requirement to have a certain level of lighting across that highway. And there was a risk that there would be a cost of additional lighting. There's also a risk that there'd be insufficient IT in place on site for collaboration. But there was a mitigation for that, which was, I said I'll come back to earlier on, was that another project was just finishing where they already set up a transferable mobile project office with all the IT and good quality 4G in it that they could just lift and transport to site. So they already had a number of areas that they were already thinking about mitigations for once they removed these top driving risks, negotiated them out. So things started to look better. Let's take out those project killer risks. Let's negotiate them out of the contract. So of course, there's still a very small chance we'll spend nothing. Most common outcomes will be around here. I think that label's wrong there. Around the 11 million mark, 50-50, 90% chance of spending 50 million. Okay, so here I mentioned earlier that that makes the tornado chart a little bit more meaningful. Now, the important thing was by spending some small amounts on mitigation, if it was worth the money, they found they could actually bring that budget down to 13.5 million pounds, including the cost of mitigation, including the cost of, for example, transferring an existing mobile IT hub to the site. So we end up with something we call a left shift. Risk budget of 15 million becomes a risk budget of 13.5 million, which sounds good as long as you've justified the costs and you're not spending more than you're saving, which was something we included in the Monte Carlo analysis. We included it in the numbers we were number crunching. So the result was actually that we've already got the delivery budget down to 82 million by understanding the variability factors, getting those under control. And we also got our risk budget down to 13.5 million, based again on using the Monte Carlo analysis to understand what's driving up cost, what can be negotiated out, and what can we bring under control by spending a smaller amount of money up front to left shift that graph and spend less. So the result was that it's potential to go in and bid, but it's actually not bidding in this case. The value of the contract was 100 million, but to go in with a position of 95.5 million pounds, meaning 4.5 million in margin, potentially, depending, of course, how the project goes, because real life is uncertain. But what that did mean for the project was an amazing turnaround to a yes decision on bid, no bid. In fact, the project team were very enthusiastic about it and were shifted from a mindset of the feeling in my bones is that we should leave this well alone to, do you know what, let's go for it. Let's outperform our competitors and say yes. Right, to summarize the journey we went on. So, as experts in our field, we provide our knowledge into Monte Carlo analysis. Monte Carlo analysis is a machine that takes what we know about the world, whether it's work estimates, variability factors, probability and impact estimates for risks, what we know about the world, and turns it into something meaningful to give us insights, paints a picture of the possible futures for your project, and it promotes teamwork, risk conversations, actually energizes people and drives performance. And ultimately, it gives the board confidence of the position, whether it's bid or no bid, that we take up, because this evidence base is quantified, that feeling in your bones. Okay, so in a moment I'll take questions, but if anybody is interested in knowing more in general, there are some downloads which or handouts, in fact, that'll be appearing on the handouts pane in a short while, which includes information about this particular service and how we offer it, can offer it to yourselves, as well as some white papers and some information about Predict. Yeah, so, right, yes, it's a very good question there. How much pressure was there for a simple yes, no answer to bid versus no bid? Uh, an incredible amount. And I imagine, I'm guessing this comes from a position of having seen this yourself. Almost everybody I've ever worked with, there's an air gap, I think, between the knowledge on the ground and translating that knowledge and conversation about variability into something that you can talk to your stakeholders about in non-simplistic yes/no terms. In fact, you've seen on telly, politicians always push into giving straightforward yes/no answers to questions, and the answer is always more complex, and things always the answer is always it depends. And actually, a picture like the one we've got really helps. So part of the work we did with our client who was bidding for this work was actually building a presentation pack to go to the board with to help them be part of that risk conversation, and partly to get them to ask the questions that they didn't realize needed asking about things like stone rate, about things like making savings across the organization rather than looking at projects in silos. So there was a bit of I don't want to call it education piece, but there's an awareness piece to the board. So those of us sat around the table had to package together what we were doing in a way that allowed that conversation to have upwards. So there was a lot of pressure for simple yes no, but the awareness piece we did changed that conversation. What we're hoping, and we're hoping that we'll do some more work with this particular client of ours, is that they'll take this as a lesson going forwards. Because actually, if anything, what they're going to find is they can say yes to more bids, or when they do more bids, they'll have a better understanding of the uncertainties and risks and feel a bit more confident in going forwards and still being here in 10, 20, 30 years' time. Why do Monte Carlo if your customer isn't asking for it? Aren't you just opening yourself to unnecessary scrutiny? Well, this is an interesting question. Do you know what? I can speak from personal experience in the way we work with our clients, actually. We use Monte Carlo analysis on schedule analysis, actually, because we want to be open to scrutiny to a certain extent, because that is the value we're offering. So anybody can come in with a bid and do a piece of work, but how many times have you seen a customer and a contractor relationship go sour and fall into scope creep, into looking at leafing through the contract in detail, because the work that I think is worth scrutinizing wasn't done up front. Because as well as internal scrutiny, I like to feel that we give our customers the competitive edge by saying, I'm saying I can do this because I can prove it. You can go with your competitors, and I did mention sort of competitive advantage earlier. You could go with your competitors, but you're not getting the quality and the dependability that you're getting from us. So it is a nerve-wracking stepping into a world where you're revealing more about what you're doing and using Monte Carlo analysis, which we sort of encourage, to be honest, because do you really want to win a piece of work that isn't going to be successful? And your moral high ground will be if somebody else wins a piece of work that you don't think you can do for less money, and see what the customer learns from that when they encounter 10, 20, 30, 40% overrun, people wake 4 a.m. losing sleep over what they're going to do over this contract that's gone wrong. We deal with a lot of currency fluctuation. Would you include it in your risk register? Now, I have seen people include it in their risk registers, and as something that could either go plus or minus. The tricky thing with that is because a risk is generally an event that might or might not happen. A currency fluctuation is something that's always there, actually, unless, of course, you're fixing the exchange rate at the start of the project. So I would be inclined to include it as a variability factor, because then you can refine which aspects of your work you're tagging it to, rather than something that may or may not happen to the entire project. Do people really get the use of Monte Carlo? Your example is exemplary. Thank you very much. It takes a while, I have to say. I think a webinar like this, of course, it's nicely packaged. Um, uh, and I'm also talking to probably people that are here because they feel they want something in their toolbox to have conversations about variability and risk. So thank you for that question, Roger. I'm guessing this comes from a place of having had to speak to people, usually up the chain, who you're really trying to get them to get Monte Carlo analysis. So in this particular example, and I think I've sort of learned to tone it down over the years, actually, because I've gone a lot heavier with the detail of Monte Carlo analysis in my sort of longer history. As I mentioned, I've been at risk decision since I was a child, and in my youth, I used to go into a lot of technical detail about Monte Carlo and about distributions and about iterations, slices, and actually packaging up the idea of Monte Carlo for the audience. This sort of level worked for the board members, plus the fact that they don't even have an hour to spare, let alone half a day. So, they had 15 minutes of a meeting that was also focused on other things to bring this bid to the table. But of course, my example is exemplary because it's been anonymized and tidied up for presentation. But this was the work of 2-3 weeks, really fast turnaround for a bid. So it took a while to get there, but it was worthwhile. Next question we've got here is, how did the client take the news that the contractor would not accept 3 big risks? Thank you for that question, Paul. Do you know, I don't actually know, because the bid, I know the bid was won. That's all I know, and the work is underway. Unfortunately, I wasn't party to the negotiations themselves, so we got the board into a position of what they would take to the negotiating table, but we weren't at the negotiating table with them. We have done something similar with other clients. So we worked with a metro project in Manchester. You might know of it. Many years ago, where there was a risk of reopening some tunnels that were closed during the beaching report. And I think it was in the 70s, and no idea what condition they were in. Those were negotiated out the contract. But actually, to be honest, the conversation is a no bid or no bid, isn't it? Is that if they're not willing to negotiate it out the contract, the answer from our perspective was going to be, okay, well, we're not doing it then. So I'm imagining they did manage to negotiate some of these things out of the contract, or certainly to say we're not liable. So even if they weren't negotiated out, it was a risk, and that it's not coming out of our budget. So you saw the 4 budgets earlier in that slide. It wasn't going to come out of the budget that we were holding. Another question here: they trust the original estimating? Very good question, because no matter how accurate we think we are at the beginning, they sort of trusted that they had the right feeling in their bones, but there isn't exactness to it. There isn't an exact science to the values being put in. It's almost always going to be different when you get there. The important thing was actually the conversations, actually. So I think it's an interesting question, in that the greater value that the customer felt from it wasn't necessarily the accuracy, but the conversations and the confidence. And so the quantification gave a bit of a refined picture than they had before. I think we'll have to wait till the project's over to see. The question for them would be, would they trust the estimating in the next project? So that'd be an interesting one to see what risks materialize. Of course, there will be risks that they haven't thought of, because they were bidding before the pandemic and before a number of other changes in the context we find ourselves. So I guess what we've heard called unknown unknowns, things that you didn't even estimate. So it'd be interesting to see how much of money they spent on things that they didn't even know about, versus how accurate were the original estimates for the things they did know about. Uh, so I think I'm afraid the answer to that question, Roger, and I think it's a phrase I think I've heard you use. It depends. Yes, we do have one final question. Did the contract value include the cost of the necessary mitigation to reduce the risk budget? The answer is yes. So that 15 million that went down to 13.5 million, that Monte Carlo, that 13.5 million included adding in the cost of the mitigation. So they priced up getting from the current value of the risks to the desired value of the risks that they chose to mitigate. And they added a column into the risk register to say, this is how much we're going to spend. How do you prevent rubbish in, rubbish out? Is another question that's just come through. Do you know the only real way to prevent it is to have conversations? Don't rely on one person's perspective. Uh, and I think that working at home, maybe the pandemic has reduced the level to which people collaborate. But the Monte Carlo analysis was actually something. It was a virtual table in a way for people to get around and have conversations, like the person who questioned the stone rate for this project. I've had other consultancy I've done for clients about assumptions about supply chain. So things are being put in to the Monte Carlo analysis about supply chain, coming up into the top of the Monte Carlo. So this is assumptions about lead times. So less about cost, but more about schedule. The assumptions being made that you only buy things when the project asks for them, and then you wait 6 weeks. But actually, that didn't need to be the case. But somebody was making an assumption about their experience in the projects they've been in, and the way we prevent rubbish in, rubbish out is to talk to each other. So it's one of the most useful conversations I've had with any of our clients is where they've invited functional leads or people who are heads of disciplines rather than just the bidding team and the members of the potential members of the project team themselves. It's people from procurement, it's people from HR, looking at resources, is bringing all those people around the table to talk about the bid, to make sure that the information being put in is scrutinized